debuting a technology that
I see. Okay.
And that has a lot of implications for kind of adoption here.
Okay.
So some reason, positive implications.
So give me a preview. What's the tech?
Well, believe it or not, it's soft tech.
What is it?
But it's a technology for understanding the influence of human machine, human judgment decision making.
Okay. Interesting.
First, works on everything.
You're not from the intelligence community, are you?
Well, my business partner consults with the intelligence community.
I worked in the intelligence community for 4 years. What you were saying struck a chord with my experiences.
It's basically, you think of it as applied to
Yeah.
doing it, applying it
Oh, I don't know.
for the last 27 years.
Okay.
Internet. As a consultant, so it's sort of bundle what I did.
I'm gonna see.
I'm
certainly not touching it. I know.
You're all set?
Okay, great, thanks.
I didn't even.
Technology that can be integrated with the operations.
Yeah. That sounds interesting. I'll definitely try to attend the presentation if I can.
I know this guy. We met at Tech Council. We made a presentation.
Are you just asking staff this semester? No, I worked. Yeah.
Last spring, okay.
I didn't know if I should have left, but I heard you. No, it's good. Yeah.
So you're from this area? Okay.
Started out Pittsburgh.
Would you want to wait a few minutes? Or do you want
Nicer weather.
Either way, up to you.
Let's wait a couple minutes.
At least this time of the year, anyway. It's rough this summer, but
No, I
I have 2 10s, a 9, and a 4. Yeah, another work Wednesday.
That's great.
I consider my step up.
Florida this next one's in high school.
okay. Yeah.
And just sort of got out of touch with Florida and then I started doing more work for Florida Power Lines. Started coming down here.
I did receive a few more
Every 2 weeks.
I'm not sure. All right, so welcome to this week's Research Café. We have Jody McBrien presenting a comparative study of refugee resettlement in New Zealand and Japan. So, very interesting topic. You want to get started?
And I'm cheating. Actually, I added the US because I realized I haven't really talked about my work in New Zealand, and that was comparative with the United States. So I decided I'd just put them all together and make some interesting comparison. So thanks for coming. It's, I know, a really busy time of year, so I really appreciate you taking an hour out of your days to learn a little bit about the current refugee situation in 3 countries, 2 of which have been resettling since World War II, and Japan is a very unique case. It kind of started resettling in around 1978, 1980. I call it a world crisis because, indeed, the refugee situation in the world right now is in tremendous crisis. Overall, people of concern, which are defined as refugees, asylum seekers, stateless persons, and IDPs, internally displaced people, are over 65 million right now. By far, it's bigger than the crisis right after World War II. And it's not going away. So solutions are really critical. Okay, so I'm going to start with some global context, give you some statistics, figures, just so that you have a sense of the world. And then I will look at some comparative perspectives in initial resettlement, a little bit about education of refugees, and draw some conclusions. In case you're not familiar with the UN definition, this is from the 1951 protocol relating to the status of refugees. A refugee is a person who, owing to a well-founded fear of being persecuted for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group, or political opinion, is outside the country of his nationality and is unable, or owing to such fear, is unwilling to avail himself to the protection of that country. Kind of an awful lot of words, and there's an awful lot packed in there. So to give you a little bit more context, this is the 1951 definition from the convention. And the 1951 convention only applied to a very small part of the world and during specific years. It was specifically designed to help displaced and stateless people after World War II. Literally millions of people who had lost their homes, had no place to go. At that lovely naive time in our history, countries believed that this was indeed the last war to end all wars. And so the convention only applied to that particular time period and particular areas in Europe because nations didn't think it would be needed elsewhere. Well, obviously, that was sadly very wrong. And so by 1967, there was a protocol added. And the protocol allowed for any time period, any place in the world where people fit this particular definition. You still see this definition, or the word refugee, misused in concert with this definition. I think a few years back to the terrible hurricane in New Orleans, people were being called refugees. Not accurate. They were still within the country. And I frankly come up against professional people all the time who really do not know the difference between migrants and refugees, which is why I like to start with this definition. A couple of years back, a very professional university librarian asked me, what's the difference between migrants and refugees? So, frankly, before I was a graduate student, I always thought refugees were over there somewhere living in tents. Not true. Most refugees do not live in refugee camps. Most of them live in towns and cities outside of their own countries. So there are many misunderstandings, and it causes a lot of problems. And sadly, one of the things that we're currently combating in this country and in Europe and really worldwide is the equation of refugees to terrorism. It's really misapplied, and I'll get into that a little bit more later in my presentation. Refugees are fleeing terrorists. They are not terrorists. And that has, I think, created really terrible disparities and more anguish and difficulty for real refugees because they don't get public support that they need. There are also some new considerations and a lot of critics of the current definition saying it needs to be expanded. And some of the expansions that researchers and some policymakers are trying to add is the idea of environmental refugees. And climate change has forced people to have to leave where they were currently living because the oceans have taken up. Desertification has also dried up lands where people were formerly living. Gender and sexuality are also new considerations, in particular LGBTQI people who have to flee their countries under fear of death, and a lot of violence against women in terms of hopeful additions in the future. So the global context, as I said, over 65 million people of concern. And when you break that down, I think is when it really becomes quite fascinating. That is 1 in every 113 people in the world. That is hugely significant. For a nation, it'd be the 21st largest nation in the world. And it's 24 people of every minute of every day leaving their homes as a person of concern. So I've probably been talking for 5 minutes. That's over 100 people since I started talking. adds up to 34,000 people every day. Gigantic numbers. Let's see, and then refugees themselves, about 16 million currently. And most of them live in sub-Saharan Africa and in Southeast Asia in temporary placement. About half are under the age of 18. And I'll also give you another definition. Internally displaced people are also a very, very large population. And these are people who would be refugees. They're in danger of their lives. However, they have not been able to flee the border. And so quite often, a lot of you know I worked in Uganda for a number of years, and that was largely with IDPs, internally displaced people, who had been put by the government into camps, supposedly for their safety, but they were not well maintained, and rebels often would attack the camps and grab kids for child soldiers from the camps. There are usually problems of inadequate safe water and food and health issues, so there are a lot of issues in the camps. Okay, I guess I missed the 80% of internally displaced people are women and children. So the UN considers 3 durable solutions for refugees. They're in a temporary status, and 3 durable solutions. 1, the best, their country returns to peace, they are able to return home. That can also be a problem though, especially for refugees who have been terrorized in their country because they're tortured because they don't want to go back. There's way too much trauma. And I saw that a lot with people that I worked with in Ghana who were being forced back into Liberia. It was a lot of difficulty. Many of them have still not returned. The second one is you flee into another country, and over the years, your country is still at unrest, and that second country allows you to gain permanent residence, get a job there. And then the third, which is by far the tiniest solution, is resettlement to a third country. When I started doing this work in 2002, there were about 10 or 11 countries that would permanently resettle refugees. Now it's about 30. But the numbers vary tremendously in terms of how many they will actually allow to be officially recognized annually. And they change by the year, as you'll see in the United States.
Judy, just a clarification. The 65.3 million and the 16 million. So the difference of 50 million, they're seeking but not yet refugees?
They're either internally displaced, stateless, or they're asylum seekers. And there's, that's another distinction I should make between a refugee and asylum seeker. That actually, even those definitions vary from country to country. Japan uses them very differently. However, in this country, we refer to someone as a refugee or a resettled refugee who has officially been accepted through the United States processing to be welcomed here as a refugee. An asylum seeker is someone, and they get that status before they come here. An asylum seeker is somebody who wants that status, flees the country, goes to a third country, and asks for asylum. Those people in the United States are often imprisoned until they get enough security clearance where they're allowed to live freely while they are still going through the process of seeking refugee status. Sometimes they're imprisoned in up to a year, which is very traumatic for people who have already had to escape great trauma.
Is that number in millions to asylum seekers?
Yes.
So refugees, 16 million, asylum seekers, some more millions, and then displaced people, the 3 add together to 65.3 million.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah. That also includes Palestine, by the way. Persons of concern, but that's an even more complex category in terms of definition. I haven't spent a lot of time on it, to be able to explain it fully. Okay, so in terms of historical foundations and resettlement, as I already mentioned, New Zealand and the United States started during World War II. And Japan in 1978, large numbers of Vietnamese, but also others in Southeast Asian crisis. And we never signed the 51 protocol, which is interesting to me because we were so involved in creating it, but we did sign the convention in 1968. New Zealand signed both, and Japan signed both. We've had a number of acts since the 40s to try to systematize refugee resettlement. The largest and the last was quite a while ago, 1980, spearheaded by Robert Kennedy. Edward. Had to be Edward. Yeah, had to be Edward. I'm thinking, no, that was right. And signed by Jimmy Carter. And the 80 Act really systematized the whole process, putting it under the Department of State, creating the Office of Refugee Resettlement, creating the offshore processes, the vetting processes, which have increased over the years, and making 9 agencies official resettlement agencies, under which there are hundreds of affiliates throughout the country. So in Florida, for instance, the Department of Children and Families houses the Office of Refugee Resettlement, and that's how we get refugees in Florida. But there's Lutheran Family Services, Catholic Charities, World Relief Fund, and Jewish Family Services, and 5 others that are officially the U.S. resettlement agencies. We've resettled over 3 million since World War II. And 1980 also set up the quota, the annual quota, which is 50,000 a year, unless the president determines otherwise. There's an annual time period when the president determines how many refugees he or she plans to let in the country over the next year. It has, in recent years, it's been around 70 to 80,000. This year, Mr. Trump reduced it to a historic low of 45,000. It's actually far lower than that because in the first quarter of the fiscal year, there have only been 22,000. No, 2,200. Is that right? I just heard this at the last refugee meeting. It was a quarter of the expected. So that about 5,000 then. So that if it's 5,000 each quarter, it's only going to get up to 20 to 22,000 total. Very, very low number. And so Japan, about 11,000 since 1979. Let's see what I've already said. Oh. There we go. So each country has its own annual priorities. And we prioritize first by who the United Nations High Commission for Refugees says is in extreme danger. Second, there are prioritizations by the State Department. These are often political refugees who are in danger sometimes because of the work they've done for the US government. And then our last priority is family reunification. New Zealand has slightly different ones. So they have about 750 a year that they resettle. And they call them convention refugees. They are officially accepted before they get to New Zealand. As soon as they land in New Zealand, they have permanent residency. It's very hard to deport them after that point. They are considered Kiwis. And they prioritize women at risk and medical emergencies. So that's a little bit different than we do. They also, their next category is the UN. And then they have 350 for family reunification, and then they set aside about 45 just as crises come up and there might be a great emergency and something unexpected, so they have a little bit from there. Beyond the 750, they typically resettle an additional 450, and these are largely family reunification, but they also leave space for asylum seekers. Japan is much more challenging to explain to you. So during the Vietnamese War, the Cambodia crisis, they were resettling a good number of Southeast Asians. But in recent years, it's really confusing, and I'm still sorting it out. I'm still, kind of going through all my notes and my interviews and everything, so I'm not done with this, so forgive me for not having it quite as authoritative as I want. It was so complicated. When I was in Tokyo, I went to about 8 or 9 refugee agencies. People don't even think there are refugees in Japan. It's very strange to hear that. And primarily, there are people there awaiting status, thousands. However, the Japanese government officially recognizes numbers in the dozens. So there are a lot of people there that really don't have a firm classification. It's a very difficult situation for them. And I just read yesterday in the news in the Japan Times that the government now has a new policy and they're going to make it even harder. And I'm thinking, how hard can you make it?
Where do they stay, Jody, while they're being processed?
It depends. And I'll get to that.
Okay.
I will get to that. Let's see. So Japan is now afraid of unskilled workers coming into the country that are not in danger. And so they're trying to crack down. They used to have it, I guess I can say this now, and if it goes to another slide, I'll just slide as it came up. So the vast majority of refugees in Japan come over on a tourist visa. And if they can make it through the airport in Tokyo, there are 2 major airports, and as soon as they get through, they typically will apply for refugee status. If they get to do that, get through the airport, they apply right away, then they can live wherever they want to. However, they can't have official working papers for 6 months. There are refugee agencies that help them out, a little bit with housing and clothing and some money. We're all aware Japan is a very expensive place to live. And after 6 months, they can get a work visa. Typically, it takes about a year for the Ministry of Justice to deny them. And I'd say 98% are denied, if not more, probably more. And so, however, if they reapply within 7 days, they're okay. Because I told you, this is very confusing. Because the way Japan reads the convention is that even though we haven't recognized them, they might be in danger and we can't just send them back home. So they get to reapply and try to get more paperwork together. This usually takes 2 to 3 years. And then they go back and they're denied. And there are people living there who have reapplied and reapplied and reapplied. I met a number of refugees who've been there 15, 18 years still awaiting status. What happens after your 3rd application is you lose your right to work. So they're making it very difficult for you to stay there. And so what that does, of course, is increases the black market and increases undocumented immigration work, which of course gives a lot of power to the employers in terms of intimidation and low salaries. And there's a great deal of that going on in Japan. So this article I read yesterday said now they're going to put people that come to apply into 3 categories that they think they can more quickly process. And the ones that are most likely to become refugees will get the work permits and others will not. And they're trying to discourage people just coming over for economic gain. So in terms of reception, and the US and New Zealand are easier to compare. So the United States offers 1 to 5 days of offshore education. So once people learn that they will be resettled into America, they, depending on the situation in the country, depending on their safety, they may get up to a week of initial English language learning, a little bit about the culture, a little bit about financing, reception, that kind of thing. New Zealand does very little of that overseas, almost nothing. They give them a booklet, welcome to New Zealand, that's about it. So, but then the difference becomes quite interesting. Once refugees get to the United States, they have one of the 9 agencies or one of their affiliates that puts them at the airport, brings them to an apartment, settles them in, and makes an appointment to come back and see them in a couple of days. So basically they're, right from the start, they're kind of on their own. Now, a lot of places where they're resettled would be apartments, and you know what? Keep an eye on the time because I could talk forever about this. Okay, so sometimes the apartment complexes have a lot of other refugees, so they will get to meet one another. Sometimes that's not the case. In New Zealand, it's very, very different. Almost nothing offshore, but as soon as they get to Auckland, they immediately go to the Mangere Refugee Resettlement Institution. And it was fully rebuilt in the past couple of years. I so want to go see it. It used to be an army barracks, and they did their best to make it colorful and welcoming. It was an army barracks. I know it's been fully redesigned, and it's quite beautiful. I've seen some pictures. Very, very welcoming. They spend 6 weeks there, and it's 125 refugees at a time. So they come and they're with others who have similar experiences and backgrounds. And they get 6 weeks to get a start on the language, get their medical checks, psychiatric evaluations, learn about the culture, the foods, transportation, all that sort of thing. And the kids spend 6 weeks in model schools. And if you've spent a lot of time in other areas of the world, you're probably aware that education facilities vary tremendously. So some kids are going to have had good educational backgrounds. Others may have never held a pencil and or lined up to go use the bathroom. And so these are things that if you just put them into the school, without that, they can be very lost. So they get 6 weeks of understanding, okay, this is the regimented school. Meanwhile, the communities that are going to resettle them get the information. You're getting an Afghan family of 5. There are, 2 elementary school, 1 in 3rd grade, 1 in 5th, or a high schooler. And so the teachers know that. They can prepare their students. They can teach them to say hello in another language, welcoming. Our privacy laws do not allow that. The only thing that teachers learn when a new child comes in is whether or not his or her first language is English. They cannot tell because of privacy laws. This is a refugee family. I appreciate privacy, but I do think that it creates a more difficult transition for the children and for the teachers and for the class because they don't have that background. They may not know. So many kids I've worked with have been just teased mercilessly, and there's no understanding and knowledge to make that a little bit more gentle. And I already told you about the tourist visas. There are many small refugee agencies, but there's not an official government agency. The UN High Commissioner for Refugees, it does have an office there. I did get to interview them. In 2016, I don't know the numbers for 2017, but 2016, officially 29 refugees were welcomed by the Japanese government. You contrast it with Germany, that received almost 1 million applications and accepted over 356,000 in 2016. Way more than we're accepting. Very small country to do that much. Okay, so after the 6 weeks, they're settled and they have a social worker for at least 12 months. In the US, you get 90 days of guaranteed financing and payment for your apartment and food. After that, other agencies will take up the slack and they have some financial assistance, helping them find doctors, get their social security numbers, all of that kind of thing. And that can work for up to 2 years, but it really varies from state to state and place to place because our refugee grants are competitive. So it's not an even allocation. The agencies have to compete for grants. So just to give you a little bit more, I'm still going through all the qualitative stuff in the interviews, so I'm just giving you a few examples. I met with the president of the Kurdish community in Tokyo a month before I left, and he said that there was a community of over 2,000 Kurdish people a little bit north of Tokyo, and they have their own sort of community center and support. And most of them are waiting status. So he said there was this really interesting connection through Turkey, that the Japanese government and the Turkish government, you may know more about this, are on very friendly terms. And so it's not that difficult to get a tourist visa to go from Turkey to Japan.
There's no visa actually.
I'm sorry?
There's no visa requirement.
Okay, that's right, that's
Yeah.
right. There is not a visa, thank you, that's right. So it's very easy to fly from Turkey. And the thing is to make it through the airport. Of course, you go through customs. And so you get asked questions, where are you going, where are you staying, where's the hotel, where are you going to be tonight, who are you visiting? So if you get tripped up and they realize that you're probably going to apply, you are in prison. And if you make it through the airport, it's okay, but if you don't, you're interned. And I'm sorry. And I had a woman from Somalia with her 2 children spend the weekend with me at Soka because they just needed to see some greenery. They're living in a really concentrated area in Tokyo. And I had gotten to know her, and I said, "Oh, just come spend the weekend. It's beautiful, all these trees." And so I got to know her, and she was imprisoned. She didn't make it through the airport. She actually had papers to go to Canada, where she was accepted. But, and she showed them to me, but for whatever reason, she was detained in Tokyo. Her 2 children were taken away from her in foster care. She was imprisoned for about a year. One of the refugee agencies that had free legal services finally got her out. But because of her status, she is not allowed to leave Tokyo. And she gets called up every once in a while by the Ministry of Justice. They interrogate her again would be her words. She said it's very, very stressful. They keep trying to see if she'll say anything different. And but she's not allowed to leave Tokyo. She's still awaiting status. She had some very legitimate reasons for being a refugee. The language training is mixed in Japan because of this unclear status and because they have a lot more business people coming in. And so sometimes the training between very unskilled people and highly educated business people occurs in the same way, which makes it more challenging. School situations are strange because, again, of the lack of knowledge and the fear of the children to say much. They struggle to learn the language. Some places are better than others. It kind of depends on how many immigrants and how many of a particular country are in a certain area. But there is no requirement in Japan to have teachers to help with bilingual issues. In both, I'm going to just go to these 2 countries right now. In both New Zealand and the United States, I think that children and youth are a second thought. They are not in the official laws and policies in terms of refugee law. The concern seems to be for the adults. Be sure they have housing, be sure that they're fed, be sure that, and the assumption is that the schools will take care of the kids. We just register them and off they go and they will integrate, which is hugely problematic, especially the older the child. And so it can be very challenging, as I said, especially in the US. It depends on where people are resettled, whether or not there are sufficient language training for them. Some places like Clarkston, Georgia is amazing. And they have, sort of their own separate refugee sort of schools because there are such a high number of refugees in Clarkston, where the kids can stay 2 or 3 years while they're learning the language and also subject matter, and then they get integrated into the schools. Other areas where there aren't so many, it's more challenging. The thing I like about New Zealand is that if you type in refugee education or something, it takes you right to the Ministry of Education, and they're very systematized there. So they have a particular language training program occurs throughout the country. They also, the Ministry of Education has a specific goal for refugee children, which is if they are in school for at least 5 years in New Zealand, they expect them all to attain the level of competence that would allow them to go to a technical school, vocational training. It is the same that they expect for Native New Zealanders. So they have very high expectations. The thing I love about it too is I asked the teacher once, I said, so you guys are starting with standardized testing now too. When do refugee students take the tests? And she responded, well, when they're ready. And I thought, doesn't that make sense? Why don't we do that? We don't have that. We require them to start taking standardized tests. I think officially it's a year from when they arrive. However, I have heard teachers tell me, oh no, it's much sooner than that. They'll start taking that right along with their class. And it takes approximately 4 to 5 years for students to become academically fluent in a second language. It can be conversational much before that, but not academic. So it's a stretch. In pretty much all the countries I've done research on refugees, people say that sports and art are the two things that help bring newcomer children together with the native children and increases acceptance. So I just want to, just pull up a Google page with language learning refugees, and you'll see here with New Zealand, got the Ministry of Education, the learning language learning progressions, which is what I mentioned is that system. Learning English, Life in New Zealand, there are free books available online for teachers and the general public. So if you do that with the US, you get Wikipedia. Now I know Google personalizes what you get. So this is mine, and I do a lot of work in this area. So you would think I might get something a little better than that. But there's not a lot of help in terms of systematic support. I already said that. Okay, and then there are also regional refugee education coordinators for each area of New Zealand. So they oversee a particular geographic region in New Zealand, help with any difficulties, help if there's bullying, teacher trainings, and also working with the refugee themselves about educational trainings. And that's very helpful. We don't have it systematized that way. And again, I spent a number of years in Clarkston. I was a student at Emory and worked with their refugee agencies. They have a pretty good program down. They've got a lot of local competent help, but not all areas are like that. School readiness, I've kind of alluded to. It depends so much on where the children come from, what their heritage was. Most Syrian refugee children have had very good education. Before the war, Syria was really very competent in so many of these areas. But then there are also children who come from very, very rural areas where there's not running water in the home, so they don't have the appliances, the things like that we just take for granted. And so, they've got a lot more catching up to do. Certainly easier to do if you're young and the vocabulary is still simple. If you arrive here as a 15 or 16-year-old where the vocabulary has become complex, and you also have to catch up that sort of background knowledge that helps youth understand the more complex subjects of high school, and they haven't had that, so it's much more difficult. Depends on if they came from a camp. Sometimes in the camp, the educational settings are hundreds of children to a teacher, which is almost impossible, makes learning almost impossible. Local settings vary. And it also depends, I've found, on parental education background. So if the parents have had education, typically the children will do better and have done better before they became refugees. There's also a lot of issues with interrupted education. So if you have to flee, maybe you were going to a good school and you have to flee. You might be, one of my friends now was hiding out in the mountains in northern Iraq for a while. Hussein bombed their house flat. They had to flee, and then they went to Pakistan, and it depended on whether the UN had money to send them to school or not. So some years they might go, other years they might not. In terms of some updates, as you know, there's been a lot of challenge with the US government in the recent year and a half. New Zealand has actually increased its number a little bit, and they're making it a point to accept Syrians, where we are making it a point not to. Canada has a fascinating public movement in helping to resettle refugees, and they're doing a really wonderful job. Japan has some interesting new programs. Just this year, they are accepting a number of Syrian university students to help them go through university. And their government is considering new policies. Unfortunately, the one I just learned about was even harsher, so I was hoping for some more progress. I also spent some time in Hong Kong when I was in Japan and learned a little bit about the real desperate situation of refugees there. They are not a signatory to the convention, and so refugees in Hong Kong don't have legal status and legal residence. So in terms of how we can redress the issues and try to support, some of the things that I've seen working very well are inclusion through dialogue. There is used to be a grassroots organization called Welcoming America that has now grown to 36 states. And they have a very fascinating, I've never heard them refer to Gordon Allport's contact theory, but that's what they do. They bring people together, native residents of towns along with the refugees, and facilitate it such that the native people can say, you know, I'm terrified of you. You're a Muslim. All I ever hear is that Muslims are terrorists. I don't want you in my town. I'm afraid. And then the refugee can say, you know, I'm so afraid of you. I see so much about gun violence in this country, and it's terrifying. I'm afraid you're going to get me deported because I wear hijab. I'm afraid my children will be bullied. And as the conversation is facilitated, they really come to understand that they embrace the same values. They both want a safe place to live. They want safety for their children. They want jobs. They want to work. They want a good community. And then it goes on from there to where people do community projects together. So maybe they beautify a rundown children's playground, or they start a community garden. As they do work together, they get to know one another as human beings. Same with, I'm sorry. Yeah.
So what you're saying, and earlier also you said that refugees are not terrorists,
Right.
they're getting away from terrorism. If you make it too easy, then the terrorists will mask as refugees to go places, and that's what they're trying to prevent by making it harder.
Yeah,
So it's an avenue that people can use to get into a country, and then, so they're not the real refugees, they're just,
right.
yeah, so that's the
I'm
danger.
really glad you brought that up. Because the hardest way to enter the United States is through the refugee process. It is by far the hardest. The Cato Institute 2 years ago did, and if you're not familiar with Cato, it's not exactly a liberal think tank. And they did a risk analysis from 1975 through the end of 2015 of migration and refugees in the United States. They discovered that an American has a 1 in 3.6 billionth of a chance of being killed by a refugee on US soil. Regarding undocumented immigrants, an American citizen has a 1 in 10.2 billionth of a chance of being killed by an undocumented immigrant. In terms of people coming over in tourist visas, they have a 1 in 3 point something millionth of a chance of being killed.
Much higher.
Yeah.
So stay away from
Stay away from tourists. Yeah, so, and the process through which a refugee goes now takes 18 to 24 months. Once they've been referred by the State Department or the UN, they go through 9 separate US government agencies in terms of security checks, interviews, fingerprinting, other biometrics, health checks. And these are only good for a certain period of months. And it actually happens that you might have been cleared for your medical, but they take so long in clearing you for the other that the medical runs out and they have to do that again. And it's remarkably difficult to get into this country as a refugee. So, yeah, if you want to come over and be a terrorist, much easier to do as a tourist. Yeah, I'm so glad you brought that up because I might have forgotten to say that. I think it's very, very important. And so it's also, you know, it's just sort of heartbreaking to me that so many politicians are out there saying, you know, they don't vet them. It's like you can get on a plane and come over when you feel like it. Not at all. It's really, really hard. Okay. Some of these other approaches, you know, respecting culture and first language and learning about one another rather than insisting on one or the other. Holistic approaches with families, and we actually have some interesting things like that being done in Sarasota. Goat Elementary and Tuttle Elementary both have programs with Vivos Now, where they're bringing the moms into the schools and helping them learn English. And most of the people who are asylum seekers or refugees in Sarasota are from Cuba or Haiti. And so it's a very, very family-centric society and culture. And so they feel, you know, much more welcomed when they're asked to come to the school to learn, and they can be in the same place as their children. And then I'll just conclude with how I like to always conclude. At its core, refugee resettlement is one of the most humanitarian things that a government can do. And sometimes when you see the arguments, well, they cost us money or something. Actually, that is not true. Research shows it's not true. That once they are acclimated and adapt to the country, that refugees bring in far more money than they were ever initially given. However, even if they didn't, they are people under the greatest possible need. They depend on generosity to survive. And so I think that it's really important, and ultimately, you know, in terms of compassion and opportunity, governments get an opportunity to be truly humanitarian with their work in these ways. That's my presentation. Any questions?
Are there any statistics on what percentage of refugees are due to wars and what due to poor government and poor living conditions and they just want to leave?
Right. You know, there must be, but I have not come across them. I would think there would be. The UN stats has that? Because I go to their stats page quite often. I just maybe haven't looked at that.
So what I'm thinking is, if it's a war situation, you know, what can you do about it? You know, it happened. So you have to absorb the refugees. But if it's because people are just leaving because of bad government and bad living conditions.
No, actually you would not qualify for refugee status in those situations. That would, sometimes people would like to think of economic refugees, but it's really economic immigration. And when you go through the process of receiving refugee status, you would not, certainly should not get it for that. However, there are other categories besides war. A lot of governments that are very repressive go out, target certain people.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking.
Political activity,
that's
torture them, torture their family, threaten them, and that is a legitimate cause for refugee.
So that's the part I was thinking. So from a big picture point of view, so let's suppose those conditions are happening in certain country, and due to which they're refugees. Then other countries on humanitarian grounds are willing to accept these refugees. But in the big picture setting, that's like dealing with the symptoms of the original problem.
Yeah.
And so when that happens, are there any efforts by other countries to improve the situation in these so that people don't have to leave?
Right. Actually, the U.S. does a lot of that. They do a lot of work with international governments to try to create other solutions. But I liked the point that you mentioned that that's sort of like just like a temporary thing. I like to point out that refugees are not the problem. They are the result of the problem.
Exactly.
Yeah,
so giving them shelter doesn't solve the problem.
Right. So peace negotiations, you know, for what they're worth when negotiations can occur that allow a more stable government.
Right.
Those are some of the things. There have been interesting suggestions. There was a billionaire last year, I think, who suggested he was going to buy an island and create a state for refugees. I haven't seen anything come of it. But it was an interesting idea. The thing is, we've got to start thinking out of the box. It's just a real problem. And I also understand communities who suddenly half the population is refugee. That's the case in Clarkston. It's a case in a lot of German communities right now, and Italian communities. And I get people saying, I miss what it was like. Although we all have to be open to change, and I think change happens a lot more quickly in recent decades than it maybe did in the historical past. But I understand that's a challenge for people who are used to one way of life. Suddenly, it's very, very difficult.
Careful.
Yes.
Japan acceptance rate, you say 2% or something, they're low. Why still people applying then?
That's a great question. It's a good question. I think in some cases, it's ease of getting there. As Murat said, there are some countries where you don't need a visa to get to Japan. Turkey is certainly one of them, and a lot of people come through Turkey. I think there's also lack of information. A lot of refugees, when they're told about the United States, think the land of milk and honey and money flowing through the streets. Literally, they still do, because they really, what do they see of us? Our media. They don't know so much about what it is. I even watched one of these videos that they show offshore, these skyscrapers and all of this great beauty, and they think, oh, that's going to be me. And then they get settled in a low-income, not necessarily so safe neighborhood, and so their expectations. Usually there's this amazing rise in hope and expectancy when they're told they come, and stays there for a while, and then there's usually quite a bit of a depression after because they're struggling and they didn't expect it. But they're also incredibly resilient people and are so happy that they're alive and that they have an opportunity to start over again. The refugees I've worked with, the vast majority are so glad to be here. Yeah, make great citizens.
Are there any examples of maybe on a state basis or perhaps municipal basis where city administration and all of that and maybe not-for-profit organizations are kind of working in a coordinated way, the same program to welcome and settle people?
Yes, I've got that experience with Tampa, with the southwest region of Florida, and in the Atlanta, Georgia area, and I'm sure there are many of them. What we have here is what we call a refugee task force. So there are typically 40 to 50 people at the Tampa meeting, includes police officers, juvenile justice people, child care, medical facilities, all kinds of people that meet every other month and talk about what's happening, what the issues are, offer solutions to one another to help out. And yeah, those are so important so that there is some coordination among services and people know who to call when I need this or when I need that. So yes, there is. In fact, the Southwest region is going to be holding World Refugee, oh boy, I need water or something, World Refugee Day on this campus on June 15th. And so we'll have a lot of those organizations have their own tables with information. We're hoping to have a citizenship ceremony, which would be wonderful for our students to be able to witness this, and some speakers, and hopefully a photography exhibit done by refugee youth. And we're all coordinating services to make that happen. So.
Is there, in this sort of mix of people like you working on this, is there some sort of common need to do something everybody wants to do better somehow, but doesn't have a way. So this is the best way to do that, and yeah, we could use that. And everybody goes to work.
So I'm not sure quite what you're asking.
Well, people are managing, all these people are managing risks, they're making critical decisions or being confronted with critical decisions, stay, go. Maybe there's health risks that they're managing, economic risks, investing in time, and so on. And so are the people that are interacting with refugees in this situation, they sort of equipped?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. Everybody gets their start a little bit differently. So mine was as a grad student at Emory and taking international comparative education. We had to do a field exercise. And my dissertation chair said, you need to go volunteer with refugees, because I remember what you wrote in your essay to get here, you know, and you wanted to do this. So I did, and that was the first I really knew about how extensive, you know, the resettlement is. And I just fell in love with kids and the families. So, and discovered that the more I was there, the more they would put their trust in me. I wasn't going to be gone in a semester. And so I came to know the stories of people and was just so moved by the need. I think, you know, I've interviewed so many refugee staff over the years, and some have either had experiences in other countries or met a family or you know, something like that they want to get involved. I'm not sure I can actually quite pinpoint, you know, what it is that drives people to do it. In terms of, is there a particular need for the refugees? The first need that comes up, aside from medical emergency, is language learning. And unfortunately, even though we do offer it, we put more emphasis on work. And New Zealand has started to do that too. They didn't used to, but they're kind of following our model. If you read the Refugee Act of 1980, you'll see it's right there that employment is the most important thing. And yes, I agree, employment is very important. But if you've only had 3 or 4 months to pick up minimal skills, we have many cases where somebody was a chemist or a physicist, or, you know, a professor, and they end up in a warehouse boxing goods because work was more important. I think if we were given the time to help people come more up to speed, a little bit more time of assistance, they would get better jobs, they would make more money, they would pay more taxes, they would, you know, but we don't do that.
I guess I'm kind of curious. So you mentioned trust, building trust between sort of the actors, if you would. So could you identify kind of maybe a common need or maybe a solution that could kind of benefit everyone probably? So I'm thinking about, okay, building self-confidence, building a sense of self-efficacy and competence in this, confidence in yourself.
Absolutely. My dissertation was looking at academic motivation in relationship to discrimination. And it was qualitative work with 18 refugee teenage girls. And so if you read the literature about minorities and discrimination and academic motivation, you discover that the greater the discrimination, typically the lower the motivation. So that was one of my assumptions going in. And that was my lit review, pretty much said that. So when I started working with these girls, and I discovered that this was not the case with any of them, one of them maybe, that was great, because then I thought, okay, so what are the factors that are making these young girls successful? I mean, really successful in a few cases. I'm still in touch with 3 of them, incredibly successful, all US citizens now. And so then I started to look at that. What are the resilience factors? A lot of it, there was religion was one factor, family support was another, educational status of the parents was another, having at least one teacher that they felt they could confide in and be comfortable and trust, huge factor.
Or a counselor.
counselor too, yeah, an adult.
It's very interesting.
So that's kind of how I like to proceed, is looking at the positive rather than the, like a post-traumatic growth more than post-traumatic stress. Eric, you had a question.
Yeah, I was just curious, how did the United States arrive at the number of 50,000? What criteria did they use to come to that number?
I do not know. I could probably find it, but I do not know.
Yeah.
I do not know. It had to have probably been about, you know, what we saw coming into the country on a regular basis before it was, you know. But also, during that time, we resettled the highest number ever, about 200,000 in 1980.
Yeah.
From Vietnam, primarily. Cambodia, Laos. So that's a good question.
I was going to ask a broader question about what criteria in general do nations use to decide whether the number of refugees to admit. But I'm sure it differs from country to country.
Totally.
So,
and there are always complaints about it, like New Zealand, 700 officially, or 750 plus an extra 450, give or take, other categories.
Right.
And there are a number of youth groups that have wanted to see New Zealand double that for several years. There's been a lot of government resistance. You know, there's always the economic argument, oh, it costs too much, we can't afford it. And fear factors.
Just to kind of follow up to that, how about Canadians? Sometimes, just from general reading, just a sense that there is no limit.
Yeah, but
we'll take everybody.
I know. They resettle far fewer numbers, although they have increased for years, because they put this interesting program in place where residents can come together, form a group, raise whatever the exact money is that they need so that they can sponsor someone to come over. They take care of them basically for a year. There have been a lot of documentary pieces out on it, and it's been very successful. However, the community that welcomes them in is, some of the criticisms is that they're too parental to the refugees. You know, they become their family and their children, and you know, so there are interesting sociological issues with it. But I don't know their exact figures.
how long do you think it takes, Jody, in a successful integration process for a refugee, resettlement process, to be successful? How long do you think that would take?
Typically, what the research has shown is that it's about 3 to 5 years.
3 to 5 years.
To really feel like you belong. You know, you may still not really feel like you belong, but that you have a community. It may be other refugees, but that you know you feel secure in knowing your routines and having employment and expectations for children, that sort of thing. And also, you know, just working through in many cases, trauma and medical issues.
All right.
Great, well, thank you very much. I appreciate you coming. You did All right, how's that next word? Thank you. So sometimes, you know, sometimes you have to sit there because you've done very similar sorts of work.
I
Never really sat down.
I was in Turkey in 2012. We accepted 4 million Syrians. 4 million. And so many Islamic State Al-Qaeda members lived among them.
I've got 3 Turkish grad students who want to come over and work with me. So maybe we should get together and talk about it and maybe see between our work and
that would be amazing.
it would be, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
Okay.
Just let me know. I'm here all
let's
the
set up
time,
an appointment.
so.
Okay, that would be wonderful. Thanks.
Limits are not the thing that's drawing people to this.
I guess not. Thanks for coming. I appreciate your questions.
Realize this size.
Oh, no. It's a huge problem. But you know, in terms of actual worldwide immigration, it's a very small number. Much, much larger numbers of just economic immigrants moving to be with family, they want to live in another country, whatever. Yeah. Where, do you know where?
Stressed out population.
Oh, no.
Shit.
Just wondered. Oh, put it down.
All right, Julie,
All right,
see you
thanks
later.
so much.
Take care.
Sure.
than what we have now.
Yeah.
Well, you can see like a whole airport. That's cool. Oh, there's a plane over there. What are they building over there?
I think it's part of the hotel or something. I like this room better. Can we move here?
Let's all meet up for class in here instead. Just like, sorry, we're coming here now.
We're gonna be here now. Okay, so. Is she gonna be little flimsy?
Do we have scissors? I thought there's scissors in here.
Should do that for her arms.
Yeah.
Is there scissors?
No, it's just extras.
Probably not.
And how many did you cut again?
Hold on. Let me go run to work.
Okay.
Yeah,
What
scissors in the
else do
classroom.
you need?
I'm just gonna start making a torso and try to fill it.
Yeah, thanks for the Sharpie.
Oh.
Anything to check there?
Okay.
Okay, zero idea. Was this idea? Yeah. I really want to use it. We should use this chair to put the body on. And we can just roll it right in. So we can roll it right in. Do you have scissors?
No, Maria's trying to get some. There were none over there.
We also, I'm gonna try to get a stapler.
Okay.
Yeah. Oops.
Paperwork. Or not.
That's a body.
That's started body, yeah.
Oh.
I'm gonna go snatch some more paper. Ooh, no, we can't. What? There's paper right there.
Yeah, no, I don't think you.
We use this. You're just like that.
And then stuff this with paper.
Yeah. I don't know how much I really want to go with the torso or anything.
I think that'll be good.
Is that right there? Okay, sits. Never have else. Well, there's two left.
Wait, did you get a blonde hair? The blonde?
Oh, we didn't get blonde here, did we?
No.
No.
So should we
Okay,
just
sorry.
crumple it up?
I don't think so, right? Do we think that needs to be bigger? Is that good?
Maybe one more?
Maybe.
Maybe one more.
Is that wide enough? A bigger wide? Because the only problem with that is when you start doing arms and legs, the arms are gonna have to be, to make it proportional, the arms are gonna have to be so small, it might look weird. Like arms are gonna have to be like that then. Well, actually that wouldn't be weird.
Just one,
That'd be
yeah,
fine.
just do
That'd be
one.
fine.
Did you find out what she looks like?
No.
Oh.
So I did look, I went to library services and asked if nobody. So, shooting baskets.
Wasting paper.
Did you guys think of that presentation?
It's board meeting.
I mean, I did have a migraine anyway to begin with, and I was just like,
Yeah, I was trying to stay away from it.
I had to drink medicine. I was like, oh, you know, play ball, get sick. I had to drink something.
That may be one more high, though, just for it to work out best.
Oh, a little higher? Yeah, I can do that real quick.
I'll make some.
And then, yeah, we can attach the shoulders once we do that. Same thing with the legs. So, we can't pick and check.
Sorry, we'll turn this in next week.
Right?
Like, can we go come back to you?
Can we get back to you later?
Later today, probably like 5:30.
So both the arms and the legs, we'll need, that's perfect. We'll need
That's our arm.
to bend it. So like we'll do the arm from like the shoulder up here, and then we'll have another bent from here. So usually here's what we did, we just did this. We taped it, and then we bent it, and then taped it.
Okay.
So it stays.
So you want me to do 2 more?
Yes,
Okay.
please. And then it'll be the same thing with the legs.
So we'll do.
So it'll be, but the legs need to be a little bit bigger, but it'll
Yeah, so I would
be,
say like,
yeah,
I would say go like the wider width left.
yeah. It'll be like the same
But
concept.
her arms are pink. Pink, it's not orange.
That's fine, because we're gonna cover up the torso, majority of the torso anyway.
Okay.
You guys like this as strands of hair? Looks like, well, she got dreads or something maybe?
I was thinking more just like big paper, just kind of like.
I was
I
thinking about that, but how can we make that circular? If we did
Well,
this,
just kind of like cut, and then kind of wrap it.
oh,
And
that
then
would work.
do a couple layers like that, so it has
Yeah, we can do that.
it has some depth to it. Or stretch it there.
Oh, really? Just throw the trash, the scraps can go in here.
Exactly.
That's actually why I got all of this paper.
Okay, there's her arm.
This is basically what elementary is. I made you do all day.
Hey, my sister's elementary ed. But yeah, this is what she does. So are we doing a,
Now, do you want me to do the leg, the,
since it is, I'm gonna be the one that says, since it is a woman, are we doing anything there, or?
she's probably fine.
That's a very valid point. Group decision.
I think we should. Is that a leg?
Okay. Yeah. Those will definitely need to be longer. Then,
Well, we can do like two.
so yeah, and then usually what we did, yeah, we could just. And then tape it here.
Did you take my tape?
And then tape it from right there. Or if we had a stapler, that would work so much better.
But this arm, so if this arm is actually, that arm's so tough to look at, but
Yeah, that would work.
see the creases right there? There we go, like that. Right away.
Oh.
Okay.
It actually is really, that's, you just gotta make sure this is sturdy.
Yeah.
There's the legs.
We may need these to be, let's see how many of these we will need. I think we'll need.
Who's your cat? My really?
So then we'll need bands.
4 of them on each leg.
Yeah, we need 4 per leg.
Right, if you want to put the arm together, I'll help you. Stuff it.
4 in each leg, so we need
Fix
4
it up,
more?
put it like,
So it needs to be
yeah,
back.
that end. Yeah. Close, close. So,
I'll take your trash, good sir. Boom. What did you learn today in school? You built a human out of construction paper.
we played God. Well, if it's
actually.
I was about to say, like, what about like arms like?
She's not happy with you. I don't even know if we can do that. No.
It takes too much back to do that, but.
So we are gonna put clothes on her, so we can technically just take these like this.
4, 5, 6, 7. So 1 more?
Yes.
Be like my hands.
Huge.
She's gonna have big.
Oh my god, she's gonna have such small arms and just like massive hands.
Big man hands.
Oh my god, just like that, right?
Yeah.
That's
Okay, there you go. There's her legs. How are we doing the neck? She doesn't have her head.
We're gonna have to make a head. We're gonna have to make a bowl.
Like a bowl of head?
Oh, you know what we could do to make a bowl? So we can take the construction paper and do this. And take another piece.
Oh,
And do this.
okay.
And just keep doing this.
Okay.
So it's big.
You want a pink
So
head
turn
or
it.
are we? That did not come out right.
She has a hand.
This actually is turning out better than the last one. Although somebody did do a cap and gown, which was really cool.
Did you take more tape?
Yeah, I just need a little.
Yeah, we're getting a lot more tape. So he's got to tape the hands. We've got to tape. It's like, don't worry, we're not gonna run out of paper. Yeah, we might. I'll keep that.
Well, we got halfway done with the body and then halfway through, so I'm good with that.
What are you doing for her hair?
I can do that now. That's gonna take a while.
What if we made like Donald Trump instead? Just have the
We actually could.
I think it would be funnier than Mr. Becker's wife, because
But it's a lady.
just a suggestion. Yeah, I guess.
I mean, we just put blue clothes on it. We could. He's got a tie in the car. We
I got a
could
tie in the car.
put
I'll put a tie on the guy.
big orange hands.
Yeah, just the hair just kind of has to be puffed up.
It could be the same. It's the same thing, just like fucked up.
If it doesn't matter.
The paper doesn't fit around it anymore almost.
It's
You're gonna have to do like half of it. It's gonna be.
and you have to start like double
Yeah.
up.
Who's doing, what are we doing with the lights here?
So I can do. If you want to do this, I can.
I'll take that.
Yeah. Just do a couple, do like 3 or 4 maybe.
Okay.
Okay. So for the legs, because we're gonna cover these up with clothes, no matter who we choose. We need space mount properly. Good enough. And we'll just have to take those.
You said 3, right?
Actually, let's just take it to the chair so that they're the same length. Or let's make them the same length. If we're gonna put clothes on them.
Kind of like
The same.
roll it to
Do what? Oh, that?
yeah, that kind of roll thing with the two-sided. Then the hands can be kind of just wrapped and then another layer underneath it, so it
Okay.
kind of gives it layer and depth to it.
Okay.
And I think the last one, if you do it the long waist, and then it goes,
Like this one?
yeah, the very last one, so then it goes deep with it, so then it,
Do it under that.
yeah.
Okay.
We're doing Trump because I'm a small hand. Don't know maybe hands.
Watch her have like brown hair or.
Right. So then.
Alright, there you go. Stereotypical white man with a blonde lady. Like, what the hell?
Hey guys, well, we got about 16 minutes left.
Okay, thank you.
Looks like a person.
It is a person.
So are we,
Your person?
we're doing that thing, all right? So how should we do the,
Just doing like a ball like that.
Doing the
I
what?
mean, not that big, but like.
Oh, that's what you're talking about.
just the big,
How would we even get those to hold on?
Maybe we can do. How big is this thing supposed to be?
She said. You gotta find a way to make shoes for it too.
How big are big shoes for lunch?
Well, we had it longer. It was on a smaller chair, and we actually used somebody's shoes, but I don't think we'll be able to do that. What's this one? So we're definitely putting clothes on this, right? It's gotta be tight, scandalous clothing. I want to see a little nip action.
how many papers did you use for that?
I don't know, like 5 probably.
So does that translate to a D or what?
Looks more like an 8 or 8.
Size-wise, are we talking here?
It looks like a sex doll.
We made a sex doll.
It's even funnier if they're just like a little bit off on size. Like what's
Like what's a little bit bigger?
Gotta pop her back up.
I don't think we should make this into the white.
Why not?
So it looks like a sex doll. I don't want to say.
Yeah, we're gonna roll the chair right in there.
Oh.
Oh, you got it. Producer Jody.
No, she's fine. Suck it up.
You're gonna hurt her back.
That's what she said. Her back is literally like that before.
No, it's not.
No.
We're gonna have to use this paper over here. Sorry.
There's more
Good.
I'm
It's
sorry.
gonna be like,
whatever.
where did you get that?
I'm sorry. This is for.
It's gonna be like, you guys use scissors, knives, and this paper.
I'll just say with printer paper. We'll never know. We'll cover it with a layer of pink paper.
Yes.
Let's roll it like a sandwich. It's gotta get it needs to have that oblong shape though, so you have to roll it like a sandwich. So we're just decide on that side. Perfect.
Okay, we got like 10.
We got
What shirt are we doing for? This thing needs to be dressed.
Please say yes.
perfect.
What else
So you
color
cover this
paper?
pink paper and tape it a couple times.
What else color?
I'm gonna hide that.
Let's do this.
We gotta put a shirt on this.
Okay, so what color? We're gonna have to. I'll go get like blue.
Or
Something
purple?
purple.
We can't leave her like this.
Yes, we can.
If you want Brett to be excited.
This just seems
Poor
wrong.
thing.
This just seems wrong, but
She has no head.
oh, we can put a skirt. We can do a skirt. So we don't have to actually
Oh,
do
yeah.
pants. So we can just kind of do
Maybe
white
he'll,
paper right up to the face. I was just saying, if you do
Maybe
a
it-
skirt instead of like
Yeah,
pants, so then you don't have to like actually wrap around the
Yeah.
legs.
but we should wrap around the arms and the chest. What are you doing?
this is for the skirt.
Oh.
Okay, I was just gonna take.
Oh, well, yeah, that's what I was gonna do. But I guess we're gonna go all out.
Make an actual skirt.
Okay. If you want to tape it.
Just like that.
Yeah, maybe a little bit higher so her udani is not exposed.
Ooh, we were kitties.
Well, like up here. There you go.
For a short skirt. All right.
We'll make sure.
Go Becker.
I don't like that we're sexualizing like professors. That's what we do.
He doesn't know.
Pretty funny when we just roll her
We're
on.
making her anatomically correct. There's nothing wrong.
Okay, here. Maybe we can do 2 layers of the skirt.
His head is looking pretty fun.
If we don't finish this, we have to think of what it is. Besides his wife.
It's his wife.
We'll just say, you know, since they did that one for him, this is a partner.
This is your wife. This is number 2. This is your wife. You're like, nobody else in class will understand this. But that doesn't matter to us.
I think I'm thinking of it on the skirt. And I'm taking it more like a dress, filling it down.
Okay,
What am I doing?
Okay,
That's
who,
good.
how, this tape is like not working.
give me.
Yeah, I need some more tape.
No, I think this is good now. I
We're
think
doing purple for the skirt, we should do blue.
Blue for the top.
Perfect, yeah, right, we should do like blue for the top, so you can see the difference. I think I got the skirt good there.
Yeah, I think that's good. Did you need more for the skirt?
9 minutes remaining, guys, 9 minutes.
Yep.
Okay.
Okay, don't forget to put your name, your team name on or near your structure.
Okay. Thank you.
I wonder where I'm gonna write my name.
No, I think the name of the team. Did you want to do this for the bottom?
The what?
For the bottom part? Are we covering her up?
She's covered. That's her knee right there. She's
Okay.
covered.
Okay.
She's ready to go to the dance.
So, how is your head going?
He came in here and she was undressed.
No, I got a body block.
No, you can see.
Wait, are we doing like a tube? Here. Okay, I know.
You don't have to like wrap it all the way around the back.
Yeah. But we definitely need to make sure, like the sleeves at least.
And she's covered.
Yeah.
Here.
We have a blue one. Why don't I make feet real
Here.
quick?
Why don't you see if this works as like a tube top? I mean, I'll do another layer to cover the midriff.
I think 2 would work.
2? Okay. You want to cut that?
Let's.
2 would work.
Yeah, can you get me a couple pieces?
Yeah. Here's another part for her. So.
I'm trying to make a shoe.
Ooh, good idea. Really couldn't do high heels.
There's more.
Actually, 3. 3 is a better idea.
There's more things.
How much time did you say you have?
9 minutes. Well, at this point, it's 5 minutes.
We'll be done.
Here's this other part of her dress.
Is that a shoe?
That looks good. Yeah. Yeah.
He's maybe a little too high.
She's got some quirky ones.
They're just hearing us in the other classroom like, what the hell are they doing in there? We just leave them like that.
Alright, I need her hair. You can put her hair on.
Okay, hold on. I'm just trying to make it so like the head isn't fucking sticking out everywhere.
Just shove it in there.
That's what she said.
There you go.
Alright, I mean, I guess this is the head.
Which one's the face?
No, I would say this. Yeah, this side is the face, so the hair like.
Oh god. Oh, she toppled over. The size of her bosom.
It's too much to bear on her back.
Alright, let's put
Stealing that. Sorry.
Okay,
There we
I
go.
need more tape. Where did the tape go? Where did the tape go?
Oh, it's over here. I got it.
Okay, you want to put the next
You can't even
layer
tell she
here
has
up?
boobs.
Maybe just kind of one piece of tape right there.
Well, we have another.
Well, like just kind of tape it here so we kind of underneath.
I'm gonna take
You wanna
this.
put it-
Yeah, where her how?
Maybe put it like.
Give
Like
her
over
some
top?
under boob.
Be like this.
Some other boobs.
And then one more tape here.
4 minutes, guys, 4 minutes. Please, well, actually, if you want, you can bring the class over here to check out.
Can we please?
Yeah, Karen is going to be a
Field trip. Well, we can roll it. I put it on the chair so we can roll.
Okay, whichever you want to do. Either way, right at 1:30, we're done.
Did you want me to put eyebrows in this tape?
Maybe we should like draw a little.
Oh yeah, we gotta draw a face. So yeah, we gotta put this on now. Or
What the hell is that?
sure.
Oh my god.
Oh, we're gonna have to take this in the back. The chair. We gotta put this on still. Here, can you-
Okay, she looks like she's sick.
Make her look pretty.
Here, we gotta move this up for a second.
Okay, she looks like she has cancer, so let's put some here.
She's got a bald spot. Here we
Cole,
go.
can you get me some tea?
Yeah. He's got one.
Okay, let's not do like she has cancer. She just got done from chemo. Okay. She's from Thailand.
Did you say Thailand?
Don't bring race into
Yes.
this.
She just got the one.
Oh, her hair is all sticking out. We need to brush it.
Did you just say? We should do something about this bosom.
I got that.
I love it.
I'm on the boobs.
Professor Becker's wife.
We're trying to do it right here. I'm trying to make a.
Okay, what are we doing for the name?
Good idea.
No, the name of the team.
I said the Beckerbles instead of impeccables.
Kind of a.
His tape is.
Just a shoulder strap on each one, and that will kind of.
Okay, here you go. Put it beside her.
Maybe put it in her hand, maybe.
Tape it to her hand. Okay, wait, wait 1 minute. Okay, then we can tape this to her hand. How about that? This lady could use some hair.
She can use a lot.
Here's the.
I got this one here. I want to look like a zombie right now. Tape all over. She's gotta look pretty.
I feel like we're past that.
Can I get just one more tape so I can like try to put some here? Above here.
Get her hair out of that. Is that good on the top there? Or is it-
One more tape. Yeah, there's no point in hiding her tip.
What if we just put a blue piece of tape, blue piece of paper in there?
Okay, we probably have to roll her. Oh.
Looks kind of like a. That worked perfectly.
Let me clean this up.
You ready for the dance?
Yes,
Is she ready for the dance?
we're ready.
All right,
We're
okay. I'm not sure.
This resembles your wife, correct? We'll tell you.
This kills me. I hadn't thought about it. Might be a little too tall. But...
See,
I told you.
That's awesome. That's really great.
I told you.
Oh, pictures of yours about this. This is the first time anybody's ever thought about
I really want this donut. Are you studying it here?
Yeah.
I just gotta pull off this recording that we recorded. It'll take like 2
No,
minutes.
yeah, they're fine. As long as you're not kicking me out.
No. It was recording you too, so I'll delete that.